Adrift in deep space, the distress signal was faint but unmistakable. Engineering officer Elias Harlow, stationed on a routine salvage operation, received the coordinates of an unidentified vessel floating in the void. He adjusted his ship's trajectory, engines humming as he locked onto the drifting hulk. The data feed scrolled across his visor, no known registry, no transpondent signal, yet the structure was eerily familiar. It was old, far older than any human craft should have been, and yet its architecture bore traces of human design. The hull was scarred with time, metal plates buckled and worn by centuries of neglect. Elias felt the first twinge of unease in his gut, but his curiosity burned brighter than his apprehension. As he maneuvered closer, the ship loomed larger on his display, an immense relic lost to the void. Against standard protocol but driven by an irresistible need to investigate, Elias sent a boarding request to his command station. The response was delayed, as if the distance between them was greater than it should have been. When the clearance finally arrived, the message was distorted, garbled, but clear enough to confirm approval. He initiated docking procedures, aligning his vessel with the derelict's external hatch. The clamps engaged, metal grinding against metal, and then silence. He hesitated only a moment before donning his helmet, ensuring his suit's oxygen levels were optimal. With a deep breath, he stepped into the airlock, the console flashing green as the system cycled. The moment the inner door slid open, a blast of stale, freezing air met him. His boots clanked against the deck plating as he stepped inside, flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The ship's interior was a tomb, silent and moving. Ice crystals clung to the walls, the temperature dangerously low despite the vessel's life support still showing nominal activity. Elias activated his scanner, its soft blue glow casting flickering light against corroded bulkheads. Readings pulsed across his visor, oxygen present but stale, radiation levels low, structure intact but barely maintaining its integrity. There were no life signs. No crew. He took another step, his breath fogging against the inside of his helmet. The walls bore strange markings, symbols that looked like a fusion of old Earth dialects and something more alien, twisted in ways that defied easy recognition. He ran a gloved hand over one, the texture rough, etched deep into the metal as if done in a desperate frenzy. His communicator crackled with static before going silent. Elias frowned, tapping at his wrist console, but the feed remained dead. Something about this place disrupted signals, but there was no obvious source of interference. As he moved deeper, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, flickering in the dim emergency lighting. The ship's logs played distorted audio recordings of a crew. Their voices were desperate, their words fragmented. "We shouldn't have come here, something watching us, we aren't alone." The final words before the recording cut out sent a chill through him. He swallowed, steadying his breathing, reminding himself he was alone. There was no one else here. He reached what appeared to be the central command station. The consoles were dead, their screens cracked or coated in frost, but the mainframe still hummed faintly, struggling to remain functional. He crouched, connecting his interface tool to the primary data port. The system resisted him at first, then relented, fragments of old logs spilling onto his screen. The ship was an exploration vessel, launched centuries ago. It had no name, only an identification code long erased from any known databases. There was no explanation for how it had survived for so long, adrift without succumbing to decay or collision. Then, something shifted. A metallic groan reverberated through the hull, and Elias turned sharply, heart pounding. It could be thermal contraction, he reasoned. A ship this old, exposed to the void for so long, would creak and shatter as the environment shifted. But the sound hadn't come from the structure itself, it had come from deeper within. He exhaled slowly, gripping his tool tighter as he backed away from the console. It was time to leave. He'd gathered enough data to warrant further analysis. There was no need to linger any longer. As he retraced his steps, something caught his eye, a door, slightly ajar, when he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't marked on his schematics, and its placement didn't match the expected layout. It shouldn't have been there. Against his better judgment, he reached for it, the meta, beneath his glove. He hesitated, the weight of an unknown dread settling over him. The rational part of his mind told him to turn back, to leave while he still could. But his curiosity, ever insatiable, pushed him forward. With a slow exhale he stepped inside, unaware that the moment he crossed the threshold, the ship had begun to wake. The ship's corridors were coated in frost, its systems barely functioning. As Elias moved deeper, his footsteps echoed in the silence, accompanied only by the flickering emergency lights that seemed to guide him. The air was stale, filled with the faint metallic scent of oxidized wiring and something else, something damp, decayed. He could feel the weight of the ship pressing in around him, the overwhelming sense that he was trespassing where no living soul should be. His fingers tightened on his flashlight as he scanned the walls. Strange symbols marked them, some resembling old human script, others foreign, unreadable, carved with what looked like deep scratches. The deeper he went, the colder it became, his breath forming mist in front of his visor. The ship was far too large to be completely abandoned. It had life support, however feeble, and power enough to keep its core systems barely operational. That meant it had been maintained, if not by the crew, then by something else. Elias found the first real sign of the previous occupants when he entered a living quarters. Bunks were still made, personal belongings scattered across the surfaces, preserved by the stillness of space. A broken tablet flickered weakly on a desk, its cracked screen displaying lines of garbled text. Elias reached out and touched it, and suddenly, the screen surged with activity. A distorted audio recording crackled to life. "This is Captain Marin, final log entry. We shouldn't have come here. The signals, they weren't natural. We thought it was a distress beacon. We were wrong. Something watching us." The recording cut off with a burst of static. Elias took a step back, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. The words hung in the stale air, sending a deep unease curling down his spine. He had read stories, of course, abandoned ships with ghostly echoes of their lost crews, strange transmissions in the void that no one could explain. But this was different. This was real. And he was standing in the middle of it. A metallic groan reverberated through the hull, distant but unmistakable. Elias froze, his pulse spiking. He turned his head slowly toward the open doorway, shining his light into the hallway beyond. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of being watched only intensified. He tried to rationalize it, perhaps shifting meta, settling under the stress of exposure. But deep down, he knew better. Something had shifted. Something was moving. He continued down the corridor, carefully avoiding the debris littering the floor. The flickering lights cast long, unnatural shadows along the walls, making it impossible to tell what was solid and what was illusion. As he approached the main command center, the doors parted with a sluggish hiss, releasing a blast of frigid air that sent ice crystals swirling into the dimly lit room. The command consoles were shattered, monitors cracked and displaying gibberish interspersed with fragments of old navigational data. In the center of the room, a massive revealed the endless abyss of space beyond. The glass was clouded with frost, but something had been scrawled into it, a message, scratched into the ice from the inside. "We are not alone." Elias's breath caught in his throat. His rational mind screamed at him to turn around, to run back to his ship and leave this cursed place behind. But another part of him, the part that had drawn him here in the first place, demanded answers. He stepped toward the ship's main console, brushing ice from its interface and initiating a manual systems check. The ship's identification data flashed across the screen. It was an Earth vessel lost over 200 years ago, officially declared missing. No wreckage ever found. Until now. The command logs were corrupted, fragmented, but one file remained intact. A distress signal, one that had never been sent. He accessed it, and the audio crackled to life. "If you find this ship, do not enter. Leave while you still can. A cold dread settled over him. He felt it before he saw it, a flicker in the corner of his eye, a shape shifting in the reflection of the cracked console screen. His breath hitched as he turned, flashlight beam slicing through the dimness. Nothing. Just the empty control room. And yet the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. A sudden burst of static exploded in his calms, loud enough to make him flinch. The whispering followed, not from his communicator, but from the walls themselves. He staggered back, the voices overlapping, urgent, frantic, too many to discern. Then, silence. The lights flickered violently, and in the brief moments of darkness between the flashes, he saw it. A shape, humanoid but wrong, standing in the doorway. The lights surged back to life, and the figure was gone. Elias's breath came in short gasps. He had to leave. Now. Whatever had happened to the crew, whatever presence remained, it did not want him here. He turned, sprinting back the way he had come, his boots pounding against the metadeck. The corridors seemed longer, the darkness deeper. He could feel it following him, keeping peace just beyond the reach of his light. The ship was not abandoned. It had been waiting. And now so was he. Determined to uncover the truth, Elias fought back the rising fear and accessed the ship's failing mainframe, piecing together its tragic story. The logs were corrupted, riddled with gaps and distortions, but through patience and some skillful manipulation, he began to reconstruct what had happened. The ship had been an exploration vessel, sent out centuries ago in search of habitable worlds. But something had gone wrong. The transmissions grew increasingly erratic, the messages filled with dread and confusion. The final entries spoke of strange signals, whispers in the dark, shadows that did not belong. The last intact transmission chilled him to his core. If you find this ship, do not enter. Leave while you still can. It is watching. It knows. We were never alone. Elias felt a deep chill creep down his spine. He had come here seeking answers, but all he had found was more questions, and a growing certainty that he was no longer alone. The air seemed heavier now, charged with an unseen force. Every breath he took felt labored, as though the ship itself resisted his presence. His flashlight flickered, casting elongated, shifting shadows along the walls. His mind told him it was just faulty power relays, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Something was in here with him. A sudden noise, a sharp, metallic scrape, echoed through the corridor behind him. Elias whipped around, his light sweeping over empty space. The hallway was just as he had left it, silent and undisturbed. But he knew what he had heard. He wasn't imagining things. His pulse quickened as he forced himself to move forward, past more walls and empty crew quarters that felt more like tombs than living spaces. Each step seemed to bring new, distorted whispers, voices just beneath the threshold of recognition, slipping away the moment he tried to focus on them. Reaching what he assumed to be the ship's engineering bay, he hesitated. The doors were ajar as if someone or something had left them that way. The air inside was cold and still, each breath fogging up his visor. Consoles blinked weakly, barely clinging to life. A massive reactor sat in the center, inactive, its core dark and lifeless. Elias's fingers trembled as he reached for the nearest console, attempting to extract more data. The moment he made contact, the screen surged to life, displaying distorted figures, blurry images of people standing in the room, their faces indistinct, frozen in expressions of terror. Then the lights flickered violently, and the whispering turned into something else. A low, droning hum filled the space, reverberating through the walls like an unseen force pressing against him. The air seemed to ripple. Elias stumbled backward, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get out. But before he could move, he saw it. A shape, dark, indistinct, but undeniably real, emerged from the shadows, standing at the far end of the room. It was humanoid, yet wrong in a way he couldn't describe, as though reality itself twisted around its form. It stood motionless, watching him. Elias froze. Every fiber of his being screamed that he should not move, that to acknowledge its presence was a mistake. The ship had been waiting. And now, so was whatever remained inside it. The whispers returned, but this time, they were clear. Leave. The word slithered through the air, layered with voices, overlapping, merging into a chorus of warning and threat. You do not belong here. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Elias forced himself to take a step back, then another. The thing in the shadows did not move, but he could feel its gaze on him, heavy, suffocating. As he turned to flee, the lights failed entirely, plunging him into absolute darkness. His breath hitched, his heart thundered in his chest. The ship groaned, met a bending and an unseen pressure. Then a deafening screech split the air, a sound so unnatural it sent bolts of panic through his body. He bolted. Blinded, he navigated by memory alone, his boots hammering against the deck as he sprinted toward the exit. The whispers swelled, their tones shifting from warning to something far more malicious. You cannot leave, they taunted. It is part of you now. Elias reached the main corridor, the emergency lighting flickering weakly, casting distorted shadows that moved when they shouldn't. His ship was still docked, waiting just beyond the airlock. He had one chance. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself harder, ignoring the oppressive force clawing at his mind. Just before reaching the airlock, he risked a final glance over his shoulder, and regretted it instantly. The shadow was there, closer now, shifting, warping, barely held together in the flickering light. It reached toward him, its form distorting as it tried to pull itself free from the ship. Elias slammed his hand against the airlock controls. The door groaned in protest before finally obeying, sealing shut just as an unnatural wail reverberated through the ship. Gasping, he launched himself into the cockpit, disengaging the docking clamps and firing the thrusters. The derelict ship loomed on his display, twisting, warping, its very structure seeming to distort as though rejecting reality itself. Then, without warning, it began to fold inward, collapsing into the void like a black hole devouring itself. Within moments it was gone. Silence returned. Only the quiet hum of his ship's systems remained, the stars indifferent to what had just transpired. But Elias knew the truth. That ship had not been abandoned. It had been waiting. And though he had escaped, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had left with him. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps as the ship began to react to his presence. Lights flared unpredictably, doors sealed shut, and whispers, not from any radio transmission, but from the walls themselves, filled his ears. The ship was not abandoned. It had been waiting. He had barely made it back to his ship, but something told him he wasn't entirely free. The way the derelict had folded into itself, disappearing as if it had never existed, left a scar in the fabric of reality. And Elias couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been inside was now watching him from somewhere unseen. The silence of deep space pressed against the hull of his small transport. He stared at the controls, fingers trembling over the navigation system. He needed to report this, to send word to command. But how could he explain what had happened? The official records would state that he had docked with an unregistered vessel, when that had simply ceased to exist. There would be no evidence, no proof beyond his own shaken mind. He gritted his teeth and focused on his breath. He needed to return home. That was the priority. Everything else could wait. He initiated the jump sequence, watching as the ship's drive core powered up, the familiar hum of the warp engines thrumming beneath his feet. He set the course manually, not trusting the automated systems. As the countdown to the jump began, he glanced at the endless void stretched before him, calm, quiet. And yet, just as the jump engaged, something flickered at the edge of his vision, an afterimage of the ship, or perhaps just a trick of his exhausted mind. Then, the stars blurred, space twisted, and he was gone. The journey back felt longer than it should have. Every shadow in the dim cockpit felt deeper, stretching farther than they had before. His own reflection in the dark glass of the looked wrong. He told himself it was exhaustion. That he was just shaken. That it was over. But in the back of his mind, a whisper of doubt remained. By the time he reached the nearest station, he had composed himself enough to file a preliminary report. He omitted certain details, describing the vessel as an abandoned relic, likely a failed expedition, its systems too degraded to recover. He left out the voices, the shadow, the sensation of something watching him even now. If he told the truth, they would dismiss him as paranoid, or worse, and fit for duty. And maybe they would be right. The medical team cleared him, though they noted increased stress levels and mild disorientation. He waved off their concerns, insisting he just needed rest. They prescribed him a few days of mandated downtime, but as he lay in his assigned quarters, sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back on that ship, walking through frozen corridors, hearing whispers just beyond the edge of comprehension. A week passed, then another. Elias tried to move on, to return to his work, but something had changed. Simple routines felt unfamiliar, as though the world had shifted slightly out of place while he was gone. The feeling of being watched never left him. He checked the station's security logs out of paranoia, but nothing was ever there. He told himself he was imagining it, that it was just the residue of a traumatic experience. And yet, the sense of unease never faded. When night, unable to sleep, he sat at his desk, reviewing the flight data from his return trip. He traced the ship's trajectory, the energy signatures from the derelict, the distortions recorded just before it vanished. His fingers hovered over the console as he considered sending the data to command. But then, something changed on the screen. A glitch. A flicker. A file he didn't recognize appeared in the system. It wasn't there before. The timestamp placed it just before he had docked with the ghost ship. Heart pounding, he opened it. A single sentence blinked back at him, the words pulsing, almost alive. You brought it with you. The screen went black. The lights in his quarters dimmed, then flickered. A whisper echoed through the room, too soft to make out, but unmistakably there. Elias shot to his feet, backing away, his breath calming in shallow gasps. The reflection in the dark shifted, just slightly, just enough. He wasn't alone. The station logs recorded nothing unusual. No power fluctuations. No unauthorized files. Just an engineer sitting in his room long into the night, staring at a blank screen, his pulse erratic. In the weeks that followed, Elias withdrew. He stopped filing reports. He stopped speaking much at all. His colleagues noticed the change, whispering about his time in deep space, about the ship that had vanished. Some joked that he had seen ghosts. Others simply pitied him. Then, one morning, Elias was gone. His quarters were empty. His access card was left on the console, his flight suit neatly folded on the bunk. The security footage showed him walking toward the docking bay, but he never checked out. No ship had left the station that night. No airlock had opened. He had simply disappeared. The investigation turned up nothing. His disappearance was ruled an unsolved anomaly, another mystery of deep space. But those who had worked with him, those who had seen the way his eyes darted to empty corners, how he flinched at nothing, they knew better. Something had followed him back. And wherever he was now, Elias Harlow was not alone.